In full transparency, I am very behind on the lore, so this isn't even a diet theory. This is like half-baked. These are just the ideas I got floating around in my head. I thoroughly believe the game, books, and movies exist on separate but tangential timelines. So instead of just being a branching timeline where one decision switched and now you have two timelines, or even as the C timelines split in Loki, where one event happens and just a slightly different event occurs and that causes separate, I think it looks more like this, where there's a main timeline and then the other timelines sometimes pop out, pop back in for major events, pop back out, and all that good stuff. But the main timeline isn't even for the games because the games contradict themselves. We see this best with FNAF World implying that Henry was the creator of Baby, which then follows the events of the Silver Eyes trilogy. Oh, hi, Wendy! As compared to FNAF Sister Location, where it's implied that William created Baby, and then it more or less stuck for the rest of the video game series, and even into the second movie. My general belief of the timeline for the games is Secret of the Mimic, Five Nights at Freddy's 4, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, Five Nights at Freddy's 1, Sister Location, Five Nights at Freddy's 3, Pizzeria Simulator, Security Breach, and then of course Ruin. Some people like to theorize that Sister Location actually happens before Five Nights at Freddy's 2, and I am fine with that theory. I'm not going to go super into why that is now. If I make a big timeline video later, I will. Just know that Sister Location doesn't necessarily happen right before Five Nights at Freddy's 3, but it does have to occur before that, similar to how Five Nights at Freddy's 2 has to occur before Five Nights at Freddy's 1. Now, if you're asking my opinion on, major timeline events, that's where, me not being caught up on the lore kind of bites me in the butt, because even though I do believe that timelines are separate, just because something happens in the book doesn't mean it's going to happen in the games, it does still help provide additional context that I am admittedly lacking. However, these are the main events that I could think of and that I have an opinion on. In my head, Charlie had to have died first. I know people like to argue as one of the Afton kids, so William was doing it for revenge, but I think William was always kind of just not that great a person, so I don't know the reason why he would do it, but I feel like Charlie is the one who tied everyone to their animatronic bodies, so in my head, she had to have died first. Next up on the chopping block would be Crying Child. I know people argue that Elizabeth died first, and that's what the line, "you saw what's happened," means. However, I'm not sold on that, and I'll get into exactly why later. However, the Bite of 83 occurs, and Crying Child is unfortunately no more, and then is tied to the Fredbear Springlock suit, which then later gets decommissioned and replaced with Edwin Murray's prototypes of the 4 original animatronics we see in Five Nights at Freddy's 1 and continued onward. So now that we have all those lovely animatronics, now is the perfect time for the missing children's incident. I believe after the missing children's incident, there is a small timeline split. In the case that Henry created Baby, that would lead to a FNAF World timeline. However, we're not going to get into that because I believe that does touch more with the books, and like I said, I haven't read those. But I firmly believe after the missing children's incident, something happened to Henry. Either he was arrested, being tied to being the mechanic of the animatronics that the children were found with, or he just left the company because, little bit too much going on. But this gave William Afton complete control over the brand. I believe that's what led to the creation of the Funtime animatronics, which did still have to be tied to Freddy Fazbear's, considering, well, they're using 2 Freddy original characters with a Funtime variant, Funtime Foxy and Funtime Freddy. But with the creation of the Funtimes leads to the death of Elizabeth. Now that 2 of his kids are dead, William Afton decides to go and dismantle some of the original animatronics to see how that works. This is probably where, you'd put all the remnant stuff, if I knew what that was. But this leads to the cutscenes we see in Five Nights at Freddy's 3, where William Afton crawls into his old spring-lock suit to escape the children's spirits, and then gets himself spring-trapped. And before the events of Five Nights at Freddy's 3, we have the events of Sister Location, where Mike gets scooped at the end of the week. But as we see with the cutscenes, and I believe the custom nights, that's where we see that he survived. And he's still kicking, for better or for worse, after Ennard leaves. Anyway, so that's my imperfect working timeline. I am willing to hear critiques, but like I said, I haven't read the books yet. I haven't even seen the first movie. I did see the second. Don't judge me on that. I was living in Michigan and had 0 friends when the first one came out, versus now where I live by 1 friend, and I forced her to watch the second movie with me. Anyways, yeah, let me know what you guys think. This was a long video, but that's because it is a complicated timeline, and this is just a scratching of the surface of it.